Most people see forest plantations essentially as something good. They evoke the forgotten landscapes of our ancestors. We often hear they boost development and generate labor. They say forestry will fuel industry and make the country grow. Additionally, trees are seen as an element that improves the environment. Therefore, it is almost inevitable that the expansion of forestry will receive support. The basin of the River Plate is one of the South American destinations for big forestry corporations. The soil's apt qualities and the activity's dividends are the explosive mixture that is carpeting the region with pines and eucalyptus. In the province of Corrientes alone, it has grown from 60,000 hectares in 2001 to 450,000 in 2011. From the time trees are planted until they are transformed into wood and paper, the forestry model has many attributes. It destroys ecosystems and biodiversity. It deteriorates the soil and sources of water. It poisons the ground and streams. It expels the land's inhabitants. It turns thriving towns into miserable wastelands and can contribute to global warming and climate change. It also generates precarious labor and cripples public health. And it does all this under the promise of regional development. It is true that industrialization generates economic benefit in the short term. But that profit comes at the cost of sacrificing the hope of achieving a sustainable economy, an economy founded on the dignity of those yet to be born. When trees kill. For most of us, the idea of a tree is a concept brimming with noble meaning. Trees symbolize many important things in our culture. Following suit, we extend the tree's positive idea to the idea of the forest.
When we talk about forests, the popular notion is to consider it at least as something positive. One imagines diversity, birds, mammals, a complex ecosystem endangered on a worldwide scale that must be protected.
Through cunning manipulation, the forestry industry calls pine and eucalyptus plantations cultivated forests, an expression that simulates harmony with nature. On the outside, afforestations appear similar to ordinary forests, since both feature trees prominently.
When thinking about cultivated trees, we think of them differently to other types of crops. We generally give them extra value. It's as though forestry had characteristics that make it environmentally friendlier than other crops.
Although superficially similar, these gigantic artificial plantations are far from being forests. They are extremely simple monocultures. A uniform mass of identical trees that, in essence, are the very opposite of true forests.
People often talk about pine and eucalyptus forests, when in fact we're talking about planted areas similar to other crops, except they're planted trees, but they have little to do with native forests.
Natural forests are complex ecosystems, formed by a great many species. Forests regulate themselves through their inhabitants' interrelationships. They recycle nutrients and compose and preserve the soil. And they've been doing this while sustaining their richness and biodiversity for hundreds of years. Each forest is the result of a circular process. While creating opportunities for the survival of its inhabitants, it is at the same time the result of the relationships between those very beings.
We have an enormous diversity of species, species that have co-evolved, that have coexisted for millions of years, all subject to environmental rules, and which are controlled by their natural enemies, by their pathogens, herbivores, etc. All inhabiting an environment in this way for even more time.
Forests are the result of a long and continuous selection, which is why they are not static. Nothing there keeps still. Everything is bustling, being born, growing, dying, being recycled. When we observe a forest, we just about see an instant of an ongoing process of regeneration and self-organization that rests on the ecosystem's memory. Forests are processes, and the mere fact of using a noun to name them can prompt us to treat them as things, stripping them of their dynamic and living reality. Forestations are artificial monocultures used to produce cellulose or timber. They are also a dead space for the native forest's organisms. A large part of these species don't find sufficiently adequate conditions for survival and disappear.
It doesn't allow for practically anything to grow beneath it. There are no epiphytes or parasites, grasses, bushes, nothing. And it doesn't feed the local fauna. It's a vast feeding desert. And the few times any of the local fauna finds a chance to feed, as in the case of the leaf-cutter ant, which loves pines and eucalyptus, to feed its colonies, they are exterminated with agrochemicals.
Without biodiversity, the environment's ecological unity is disintegrated. The essential processes of recycling nutrients, water regulation, and soil formation are all cut off. When the ecosystem is eliminated, everything that was created through evolution is sacrificed in lieu of cultivating a single species of tree.
So, what do they have in common with a forest? Nothing. They are basically the same as large monocultures of soybean. They are based on the same agrochemical packages and on extracting all resources found there. They live off the water and the soil and have a severe impact on people, which is another part of the woods. A forest is an ecosystem where people live, that provides life for people. It feeds people, grants them the materials to build their homes, to feed on, to cure themselves with medicinal plants, and this offers none of these things.
For the industry, each planted tree isn't there to protect an ecosystem, or its biodiversity, or the people that inhabit it. Each tree's sole objective is to produce cellulose or commercial timber. For the industry, the forest's organisms, including people, are an obstacle that must be eliminated to accomplish this objective. Forestations are planted by doing away with natural ecosystems and human societies. Of course, it was not always so. Many forests did not disappear due to forestations. In the province of Misiones, for a whole century, productive decisions were the bane of native forests. Government after government made the same mistake, to think that a local economy should be based on a single produce. They first exploited native timber and wild yerba tea. Hundreds of work posts set up in the heart of the jungle cut down the tallest trees. The forest's wealth was thought to be unending, and on a par with the tree lifting, they pruned the native yerba specimens. The forest's logs floated downriver on rafts, while on the Paraná River steamboats brought thousands of settlers to this new land of promise. With the government's stimulus, the areas of degraded forest were handed to the settlers, who burned everything and focused on yerba crops. The government thought this would save the province's economy. But then the inevitable happened. When the farms were brimming with planted yerba, excess supply lowered prices and the settlers were left with the poorest cut. Then the government appealed to a new productive variation, cultivating pineapple, tongue tree, other teas, plantain, potato, cassava, citric fruit, tobacco, a long list of magical solutions for farmers. But with each of these single-line production schemes, the economy grew more fragile and the soil deteriorated. The success of the first years vanished when productivity declined or a plague attacked. So new plots of land in the forest had to be burned. Failure after failure, settlers were just as poor, and searching for a future for their children, they migrated towards the towns. Meanwhile, the province's real natural capital disappeared, and Misiones gradually lost its fertile land. This was when the last productive stage of this story began on those abandoned farms. The old estates became forestry plantations. Nearly half of the province's reforested lands have this origin. Governments understood this was a solid business. As of the 1970s, they began subsidizing the clearing of forests specifically for forestry plantations. Today, Misiones has a total of 350,000 forested hectares and has lost 80% of its native jungle. Simultaneously, forestry plans consolidated an enormous amount of power in the hands of only a few companies. Misiones lost its main natural capital, and governments improvised desperate productive solutions. The ideas behind those decisions eliminated forests. They swapped diversity for monocultures and deteriorated the soil. And this cycle is maintained at present. The arrival of Brazilian immigrants, landless farmers and unemployed city folk to the center of Misiones is producing a brutal colonization of the jungle with fire. Settlers dedicate themselves to growing tobacco. Many are illegal and poor in extreme, and are at the mercy of the cooperative tobacco groups. Children and adults work very hard in extremely vulnerable conditions, at great risk to their health. In 5 years, the land is exhausted and a new patch of forest is burnt down. After this, on the abandoned farms, the pine trees arrive. The transformation of the Misiones jungle into forestations is a brutal simplification of the ecosystem due to bad productive decisions. Towards the south, in Corrientes, where there never were any forests, they plant the crops directly over natural grasslands. It is easy to understand that eliminating forests in order to cultivate trees is an eco-social crime. But many people think that growing a forest over grasslands improves the environment. However, this only conceals silent and relentless destruction.
Here we have an issue that is a European vision of our own ecosystem. Above all, Argentina and Uruguay. Much of their population comes from migration. These people come from ecosystems with forests. So grasslands are barren places. There's only grass, many people think. That's just grass. And they forget that in our countries, most of the biodiversity is on grasslands, not in the woods.
We have been educated with the idea that ecosystems are forests. They have been used so often as examples that we believe that only forests are ecosystems. So it is almost natural to consider treeless environments as empty spaces. But not all natural ecosystems abide in forests. In relation to the weather, water, and the ground, nature develops the best ecosystem suited to each region, whether it is scrublands, woods, or grasslands. In fact, grasslands are found where forests do not prosper naturally. Grasslands appear empty, but this changes when we look at them from below. They're complex ecosystems, self-regulated and self-organized, just as forests are, but instead of trees, there is grass.
A prairie has hundreds or thousands of species. That's where our wealth in terms of biodiversity is. And that is how this ecosystem works. It is adapted to the weather, the ground, extreme temperatures, lack of water or excess water. That is why this kind of ecosystem developed as opposed to a forest. It is the ecosystem that has adapted to the environment and the one that gives life to all our biodiversity. A large part of our mammals and birds feed off grasslands, not the woods. They don't even know how to live in a forest.
The grasslands of northern Corrientes have a unique biological wealth. The Aguapay area is home to the pampas deer, the strange-tailed tyrant, the yellow thrush, the maned wolf, amongst other species already extinct in the rest of the country. And the main extinction levels were recorded on the Pampas plains. Today this landscape is a scene of massive crops with ever more machines and fewer people. Agriculture's enormous transforming power is translated, on satellite images, into a vast grid that extends across the territory. This region was covered by grasslands that disappeared a century ago, and along with them, nearly all of its wildlife. Some managed to survive where agriculture was not able to gain access. And this is what happens in northern Corrientes. For over 2 decades, extensive cattle farming guaranteed the survival of the pampas deer and other species. In this case, production was conservation's best ally. But now things are changing, and forest monocultures are threatening this precious balance. In barely 15 years, forestry has eliminated 30% of the grasslands needed by the deer, and everything indicates this will continue. These species will become extinct as long as we continue to believe that grasslands are empty, and that planting trees there improves the environment. A grave mistake that is doing away with this ecosystem.
In environments characterized by shrubs, grasses, savannas, when we introduce trees such as pines, we not only introduce a new species but a new way of life as well. And native fauna and native flora are not adapted to this new way of life. What problems do pines bring? Where grass predominates, they are related to drastic modifications in the environment.
When forests are implanted on grasslands, the effect is disastrous. As the trees grow, the development of plants and animals is interrupted, substituting a complex and diverse environment for a tree monoculture.
This is a very particular monoculture. One can compare it to soybean, another monoculture. What happens with soybean? What's the difference with pines and eucalyptus? Soybean is annual. These are permanent crops. So if one was serious, one would say, if I've done 2 or 3 years of soya, the ground is depleted, I'll stop sowing soya and plant something else. This doesn't happen in forestry. It's already planted. We are talking about cycles that can go up to 7 in the case of eucalyptus, or 15, 20 for pines. And often, in both cases, after the first harvest, a new monoculture is planted. There may be 2, 3, 4 monocultures in a row, and re-establishing grasslands or a forest is very difficult after a harvest. It's very difficult, almost impossible, due to all the changes that took place during all the years of monoculture.
The changes produced by afforestation are drastic and often irreversible, and these changes begin from below. We see ecosystems, but we rarely take notice of the soil that sustains them. Nonetheless, they both are a part of the same life cycle, a cycle ruthlessly cut short by afforestation. Forest crops extract an enormous amount of nutrients. Estimates show that in 45 years, with 3 consecutive pine crops, the amount of phosphate extracted would be equal to that fixed in 10,000 years. A large part of the nutrients taken by the tree leave the ecosystem when logs are extracted with their bark. After the first or second harvest, many plantations are not viable unless a large amount of money is invested in chemical fertilization. But the damage to the soil is much more serious. An ecosystem is the expression of the biodiversity archived and safeguarded within the soil. A 30-ton tree was a seed treasured in the earth. The ground is the ecosystem's guardian and its guarantee of survival. Perhaps we should start thinking of the various land ecosystems as manifestations of a single unit, the living soil.
The ground is not just nitrogen, phosphorus and potassium, as agricultural experts would have us believe. The ground is a living ecosystem with an enormous amount of life that ensures that the soil is in working order and constantly being recycled.
Paying close attention to these images of grassland soil, we can indeed see the biodiversity that inhabits it. Some of its organisms are visible, many others are microscopic. There are millions of them in a gram of earth, and they can add up to tons per hectare. They are in charge of the heaviest and least visible tasks in an ecosystem. They recycle nutrients, fix nitrogen, incorporate organic matter. They maintain the ground's structure, its porousness, its humidity. They make the soil work. Harming them implies degrading the main source for our food. These minute beings, with their unending movement, are the groundwork of social processes. There is no hope for our children without them. The soil's biodiversity is the least understood and the most vulnerable. Even so, monocultures decimate them. This begins with a chemical change. Trees take calcium and magnesium from the ground, making it acid, which is then heightened with the accumulation of leaves and vegetable remains. In addition, pine leaves liberate toxic substances, such as polyphenols. Plantations extract water from deep underground, which upon rising drags along salt and other substances. Aluminium content increases slightly in afforested soil. This element is toxic for many soil-producing organisms, such as bacteria and fungi. With soil that is more acid, salty and toxic, the organisms that recycle nutrients disappear, and the ground's vital processes are discontinued. It has been shown that the decomposition of organic matter in pine and eucalyptus crops can be 15 times slower than in grasslands. And this has profound social consequences.
In the south of the province of Buenos Aires, in Sierra de la Ventana, studies have shown that growing pine wood provokes changes in the structure and conditions of the soil that make it less adequate for agriculture. This means that unintentionally one is conditioning the land's future uses when opting for forestry. Forest implantations many times narrow the possibilities for future development. I mean, it's difficult for a farm to go back from forestry to cattle or agriculture.
Farms set up in Misiones over felled forests perform very poorly. The drained soil can no longer be used to produce quality food in large quantities. Compact forestry over thousands of hectares of grasslands in Corrientes is condemning the ground. And the situation gets worse when one considers water. Farmers in Misiones know that if there is forestry, it is only a matter of time before the water disappears. In Libertad, Jorge Villalba works a little less than a hectare. In mid-December, his plants are suffering the subtropical heat. He needs to water his crops and vegetable garden. But forestry has finished with all the region's streams.
Here in Libertad, there were dozens of streams. Where are they now? You have to go some 20-30 kilometers to find one. Before there was one right here, and further there another. And now no longer. It's all dried up.
To save his plants, Jorge Villalba needs a well to reach the groundwater. For a little money, two neighbors do the hard work. Under the jungle's protection, 4 meters used to be enough to reach water. Now they are expecting to find it a lot deeper.
Well, at the level we are now, 9-10 meters, 11, it may turn up, because we are downhill.
A given in all forestry regions, the stream that no longer exists and deepening water. When plantations eliminate grasslands, the ecosystem's hydrologic regime is completely changed. When it rains on well-preserved grasslands, water practically goes directly to the ground. A large part filters down to groundwater, and the rest circulates without eroding by dragging sediments.
Let's imagine that same prairie now, with a pine tree plantation. Let's picture those pines in particular. They are tall, they have a lot of foliage, and they keep it all year round. So what happens when it rains? If it doesn't rain enough, the water may not even reach the ground.
When it rains over forests, a part of the water remains on the foliage and evaporates, and another part is retained by fallen leaves and does not filter through. Additionally, while they grow, trees consume a lot more water than grass, even from deeper layers. On the one hand, less water provided by rainfall, and on the other, a higher rate of consumption in the ground. The result is a negative water balance. More water is taken out than put in. And this translates as a lot less water available.
Every time the debate resurges, technicians appear, experts saying that there is no scientific evidence to show that the eucalyptus and pine trees have an impact on water. And just like that, they intend to convince people that there is no impact at all, and that is simply not true. It's not true because there is some research, and it has been found that there is a negative impact on water. And then there are the locals who always say the same thing. Since the arrival of the eucalyptus, the arrival of the pine trees, the waters dried up, and there is a kind of amnesia around the fact that decades ago, the world over, but especially in Uruguay, planting eucalyptus was encouraged to dry up wetlands considered at the time as unhealthy unproductive ecosystems that were better off dry.
Forestations now don't seek to dry up wetlands, but they still do so. From above, we see the western lakes of the Esteros del Iberá marshlands surrounded by forest plantations. The impact on this strategically important wetland is incalculable.
Iberá lives on water. Water is a marsh's blood, so the way in which the plantations interact with water will also determine the dynamics of the entire system. What do I mean by this? That at least locally we will probably at first see small lagoons drying up as a function of the pine's water consumption, which is greater than what falls directly over the plantation. These pines consume more water than what falls directly on them, and this means they have to be draining the surrounding area.
In years of little rainfall, lagoons dry up, but there is one more problem. Pine trees are an invasive species, especially in subtropical grasslands. A crop produces hundreds of millions of seeds, and many germinate outside the plantation, spreading out in clusters. Afforestation first dries up lagoons and then colonizes them. This swamp is surrounded by afforestations. It slowly dried up and is now being invaded by spontaneous pines. Once the pines settle in, water extraction increases, and this vicious cycle ends up drying it completely.
This means that a mechanism that feeds back into itself is generated, allowing pine trees to generate the conditions appropriate for their own seeds. And so the areas that today are ecologically banned from afforestation because water hinders the growth of seeds are gradually opened up to the spontaneous advance of pine trees, or eventually to new plantations.
The 450,000 hectares planted in Corrientes are already expanding spontaneously. Many invading clusters are within the Iberá Natural Reserve, where there shouldn't be any massive forestations. The consequences of the invasion will become apparent in the future, when controlling the pines will no longer be possible. Breaking the water balance is a common occurrence when afforesting over grasslands. But the industry always has a more important argument to defend the model. The idea of planting trees to capture carbon dioxide and mitigate climate change is the forest industry's main argument. However, the exact opposite seems to occur. In Misiones, the jungle was the best possible reservoir of carbon. Destroying it does away with more than what afforestations can themselves fix. On grasslands, the situation is less visible. There, most of the carbon is stored in the ground. When planting trees, these accumulate more carbon in their logs and branches than grass. But after the harvest, this carbon exits the ecosystem, and once transformed into cardboard or paper, it decomposes quickly, returning to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. The tree's roots, branches and leaves are not completely incorporated into the soil due to the chemical and biological changes produced by afforestation. Additionally, much of the carbon stored by the grassland's soil is also lost. In some places, the loss outweighs the accumulated carbon in the trees. And so, when grasslands are swapped in exchange for crops, the amount of carbon emitted tends to be greater than the carbon stored. And in these cases, afforestations contribute to global warming. Toxic, lifeless soil. Silent, relentless invasions. A fractured water balance. A future denied to the next generation. A society that will not be able to survive without its environment. And yet crops grow uncontrolled, and the short-term economic outlook is our society's executioner. Local communities and leaders think that afforestations will bring regional development. But reality tends to be different. If at one stage plantations demand labor, this early prosperity disguises an impending employment void. In its entire cycle, the cellulose industry creates on average one job every 70 hectares. A lot less than if the land had been dedicated to other productive activities. But today, this is impossible. Afforestation spread and rural communities agonize and die. Between 1991 and 2001, the urban population of Puerto Libertad went from 49 to 71%. During that time, more than 90% of this municipality in Misiones was covered by afforestations. Out of a population of more than 1,000, only 2 settlers remain at the kilometer 22 stop in the municipality of Puerto Piray. Their neighbors emigrated long ago to poor villages. 60 years ago, Chocho Benitez was born in this house. Here he was raised, and here too his children were born. Now he and his wife live alone, isolated by forest plantations.
There were more than 1,000 people here. Yes, loads. My old man worked here 37 years. We are 12 brothers, born and raised here. We were all raised here.
The forest industry goes to great lengths to remove the inhabitants and erase the social memory from the land it occupies. The clearest example is the school. Closed for lack of students, it is being demolished, leaving no remains of the old population. Chocho does not want to abandon this place, even though staying is hard. The isolation and lack of neighbors are a burden on him and his wife. But his destiny is set. In the end, the vestiges of his community will lay buried under the pines, and they will move to the village. In afforested villages, hope of a better life can quickly vanish. According to the latest national census, while Misiones' average unemployment rate was at 27%, in the most afforested municipality it peaked at 37%. Here the industry is all-powerful over the citizens. Those that are lucky work in a cellulose factory or in forestry byproducts. Many compete against each other to gain employment in outsourcing companies. Selection is fierce because they pick those who produce the most and charge the least. Others manage to get a temporary job in the local sawmills. In most of these, the majority get paid off the books. Accidents inherent to this line of work are yet another sentence. With no union or labor insurance, the mutilated have to make do with disability benefits. Many are not even lucky enough to work illegally in a mill and depend on official welfare assistance. This is the life settlers live in afforested villages. What looked like a good employment opportunity turns into a 21st century form of slavery. Under constant threat of being fired, employees are subject to all sorts of abuse. To understand this, it is enough to get to know the chainsaw workers of northern Misiones. When the Argentine company Celulosa Argentina was privatized and sold to the Chilean Alto Paraná, the majority of its employees had to depend on third-party contractors. As the scale of production grew, jobs entailing pruning, thinning and felling were a permanent source of labor and therefore of illegal hiring, abuse and arbitrary layoffs. In outsourcing the tough and high-risk jobs, the company did away with many problems. But after 10 years of abuse, labor conflicts finally broke out. Chainsaw workers blocked the access to the Alto Paraná cellulose plant, forcing it to shut down. There was a great deal of tension, and the pressure was felt all over the province. Finally, the national state had to intervene. At first, workers were able to increase their salaries, reduce working hours, and improve labor safety. However, a little later, Alto Paraná began financing the contractors in purchasing processing machines. Watching these work is an amazing experience. It takes them less than a minute to reduce a 15-year-old pine tree to a tidy pile of logs. A single machine operated by 3 people does the work of 12. In addition, it is a lot cheaper than a fair salary, and it makes no labor claims. As with any monoculture, forestry economics lowers costs by increasing scale. With a chainsaw, one person can harvest 780 tons of wood per month. With these machines, each employee yields nearly 2,900 tons. In Misiones, as the volume of processed wood increased, hired labor decreased. Today, 70% of the workers have lost their jobs. What is happening in Misiones is the forest industry's optimum goal, a highly mechanized process with minimum human labor. However, some settlers still resist. At Puerto Pirai's kilometer 18 stop, farmers gather in order to search for alternatives for their production. They want to industrialize what they produce for the local market. This is their only alternative in the face of the employment void proposed by the forestry model. It is also a way to reduce the desertion suffered by their farms and the exodus towards the villages. But this will not be an easy struggle. The space they have to carry out their production is restricted by afforestations. What still stands in this old colony is a narrow 100-meter strip by the road, within an ocean of forests. The small farms can barely produce anything surrounded by trees.
I've been watching the growth of plants for many years, and I've seen that on the edge of pine crops, annual plants don't grow. This one is about 20, 30, let's say. That's quite a bit. And there the branch is 1 meter tall. When it's further away from the pines, it's a meter or more. All across that part I planted maize, because it grows better there. They develop very well. But that's 100 meters away from the pine plantation, that maize that developed properly.
The effects of afforestations can be seen in all the neighboring crops.
In cassava, in maize, in this watermelon here, in melons, in the pumpkin I showed you before, in everything. The way I'd sum up the situation is, this is a model, and when I say this, I mean the model of large-scale monocultures, such as pine trees, eucalyptus, soybean, any large-scale monoculture being imposed. This model, from a human point of view, is empty and dead. I'd use those 2 words. Why empty? Because wherever this type of monoculture settles, it rejects people. But to what cost? That's why I say empty and dead, because it destroys the ecosystems, rural life, and it drains the farms to the benefit of large national capital, and even foreign as well.
This is how the forest industry's social cycle comes to a close. Fields covered by blocks of forests, disappearing settlements, unproductive farms, jobless rural families, forced out to miserable lives in the villages. In the present situation of the inhabitants of Misiones, one sees the future for those in Corrientes. Aside from any promises, progress belongs solely to the big companies. Worse still, living in an afforested village is submitting to daily deterioration in health. Puerto Esperanza's hospital is filled with children every time the pressure drops and a westerly breeze picks up.
I believe the increase in respiratory pathologies is the most important parameter we have, the increase in allergies.
Puerto Esperanza is just a few kilometers away from the Chilean Alto Paraná cellulose plant, in the heart of the afforested north of Misiones. Since the plant has been fully operational, the percentage of children with respiratory affectations increased 25 times.
I always tell this anecdote. I went to primary school in Wanda, where a boy with asthma or breathing problems was unusual. There was 1 out of 30 or 40. In my class, there was 1. And today, in a classroom, we estimate that over 60% suffer from breathing disorders, asthma and others, right? Allergies, processes that make children take medicine from a young age. And this is the reality seen in every home.
Toxic emissions from the cellulose factory are part of the air breathed by the inhabitants. With a change in smell, parents already know that their children will have breathing problems.
People in the area know roughly when to prepare, because when the weather starts to change, we already know that the next day, or in a couple of days, kids who unfortunately suffer from obstructive bronchitis, wheezing babies, asthma, they will all show symptoms because we perceive a very particular smell, the result of toxic emissions into the environment.
But toxic gases are not the only cause. Respiratory ailments normally increased in winter. But the tree's massive blooming blurs this seasonal difference, and medical appointments run throughout the year.
This has to do with different allergic phenomena. Pollen, for example, as of September-October, when respiratory diseases traditionally waned, pollen now sustains these diseases from October straight through January. So even though seasonal differences remain, we can see that breathing disorders have drastically increased throughout the year.
Pollen, toxic gas, smoke, insecticide, permanent threats to the health of children. But beyond the daily suffering of a sick child, Dr. Vera is more concerned about the future.
Obviously, chronic consumption of medicinal drugs in the long term, permanent relapse of breathing pathologies throughout the year, this combination of disease and medicine, chronically, obviously the quality of life, ours and our children's in the years to come, will not be the same, because reaching 60 or 65 years of age, having taken drugs all your life, the medicine has side effects in our nervous system, cardiovascular and respiratory systems. So it's a combination of many things, but many of these we'll see later on, based on a delayed analysis as well, since it will show us what's already happened, and there probably will be modifications based on that, but it will be all after the fact.
The economic health of these companies is paid for with children's disease. Economic growth is paid for with devastated ecosystems and poor societies. This is the equation of the chosen model to produce cheap cellulose. But is this type of cellulose production cheap? The forest industry, just as any other monoculture, bases its economy on costs it does not pay. The cost of eliminated grasslands and jungles, the cost of destroyed soil, the cost of dried streams, lagoons and springs, the cost of unemployment, the cost of misery and disease. These costs are excluded from financial calculations. If the model were to acknowledge them, cellulose production would be as expensive as unfeasible, and the entire business would collapse. But the forest industry does not pay for this, which turns these costs into subsidies taken on by the environment and the state. The present and future Argentine society is receiving social and environmental destruction in exchange for prolonging a model that only seeks short-term economic utilities. And most of this is done to produce articles that end up in the garbage. In Chile, Uruguay, Brazil, and Argentina, the same model is repeated. Paper for books and notebooks represents nearly 1% of the entire production. Almost half of what is produced is timber, and the rest is cellulose paste for cardboard, wrapping paper, toilet paper, kitchen rolls, and newspaper. It is used once and thrown away.
So we are destroying ecosystems for that type of produce, for completely disposable things. There's the abuse. So what needs to be made clear is that most of the cellulose produced is not for paper. Most of what is for paper is dispensable, and a very small part is for useful paper. So we are mortgaging the future. Even more than mortgaging, we are giving it away. That's not even a mortgage. We are giving our future away, and all we are measuring is GDP. Nature isn't interested in GDP, and neither are poor people.
With each increase in GDP, there is an equivalent decrease in the future that still remains for us. We tend to hear that the world needs more paper and more cheap cellulose, and that producing it will grant us growth and development. There is no development in a devastated world, and this also questions the notion of producing raw materials for export as something necessary.
When you compare Uruguay's consumption per capita, which is roughly 30 kilos per person per year, which is a lot, we waste a lot of paper. When compared to Finland's consumption, which is 400 kilos, you say, well, what are they up to? They don't read more than we do. I doubt they go more often to the bathroom than we do. So it's clear there's a huge waste of paper when you compare the numbers between rich and poor countries. You say, well, something's wrong here.
Society is paying for the irrational growth of an industry that makes us poorer, in order to supply an insatiable market with dispensable material. At the same time, the growing biofuel business from cellulose opens the door to new squandering. As if this were not enough, the Argentine state subsidizes afforestation economically, directly or indirectly, since the 1970s. Through tax relief, benefits, and direct subsidies, the state has granted thousands of millions of dollars to the forest industry. The last instrument was 1999's law number 25,080, extended for 10 more years in 2009. Governments and companies keep betting on economic growth by way of cheap raw material production for export. Industrializing them improves local dividends, but does not compensate for the liabilities of monocultures subsidized by society and the environment. Even so, forestry's latest trap is lurking in the aisles and shelves of shops. Many responsible consumers buy certified products that support a healthy environment. A large amount of these forestry certificates do not guarantee any of this. They just favor company business. The main problem is that it isn't possible to certify a process that implies changing an ecosystem for a monoculture or intensifying a previous modification. In addition, companies can be very cunning. They nearly always certify just a percentage of their plantations, and they then use the seal for all of their produce. The certificate is the model's shield to disguise their dirty business. In Argentina, the certificates are prone to unsuspecting irregularities and corruption. This afforestation we are seeing now was recently certified. There are no wildlife corridors. There are no protection bands for internal lagoons. The plantation is a single sheet that only avoids the spots where pines cannot grow. As if this were not enough, it lies within the Ibirá Natural Reserve, a protected natural area. With these certificates, companies rest easy and some non-governmental organizations get juicy economic benefits. Meanwhile, governments shut their eyes and allow themselves to be led by the globalized market. This is how they shrug off their responsibility to safeguard a healthy society in a healthy environment.
So governments today are absent because they're only watching the macroeconomic numbers, how much is exported, how much GDP is growing. But reality, the future this is killing, that they don't want to see. One can place all the evidence on the table. Effects on the soil, water, flora, fauna, people, everything's there. Proof abounds. I assume that the state is not dumb. They have a different vision. A vision that supports this development model. A model with no way out. So while they blather on about sustainability, which has by now lost all meaning, they carry on backing this model that is completely unsustainable and evident to anyone.
The forest industry is certain they can make us believe everything they say. For example, that forest plantations are good, and that it is always better to plant trees where there are none. The evidence shows that in monocultures, trees kill. To think that the main problem with the forestry model is the pollution from pulp mills is a naive concept that hides the complete cycle of destruction. Some people think that factories with smoking chimneys are ugly, but they see afforestations as pretty. But they are stages of a grander process. Anyone who finds beauty in rows of millions of pines should observe what is left after it has all been razed to the ground. That is where the forestry model expresses its cruelest dimension, a devastated, lifeless landscape, a cemetery of logs and branches. This is the crop's purpose, the first stage of a production line that generates wealth to the detriment of society and the environment. Every forest plantation is the previous step to a complete hack-down, and this in turn is the step before a polluting industry, and this is the stage before tons of paper and cardboard are thrown away every day, thousands of kilometers away. Over destroyed ecosystems and broken societies rise corporate bank accounts and the power of a few government officials. Meanwhile, in forest congresses, the industry and its friends cynically state that the forestry model is sustainable.